L300. Hey, welcome to the channel. If you're returning, welcome back. So today, I've got Delilah, my L300 in the shop. And as you heard, the belts are squeaking pretty badly. They've actually been squeaking for quite a while, and I've been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, fixing it. Mainly because Delilah and I have a little bit of a history together. I fix her, she breaks down. I fix her again, she breaks down again. I fix her again, and she breaks down again. And this is kind of our relationship over the past 8 years of ownership. I haven't been all that keen on doing the job. Unfortunately, it's gotten to a point now where it's actually embarrassing coming to a stoplight or a stop sign, so we need to take care of it. Well, first thing we're gonna need to do is obviously access the engine bay. And if you have an L300, I'm sure you already know how to do this. Of course, being an L300, it's awkward. But once we've got all that out of the way, we can pop our seat up, and we're missing a piece. Well, that's interesting. There should be a piece of fan shroud here. It's gone. I wonder where that went. Well, it looks like what's happened is I've lost a clip that goes over the top to hold everything in place. So the vibration must have just allowed the shroud to fall off. Guess I'll be remaking a new clip here. At least I still have the part though. And now we can get the driver's seat out of the way. So you got 4 bolts in the seat itself, 2 in the front, and then 2 at the back. Front one's out first, slide the seat forward, and now you've got easy access to the rears. Once you got them out, you can pull the seat right out. Now, you shouldn't have a mess of wires under there like this. This is my glow plugs temporarily wired in, so I need to put a new glow plug module in. Now we can remove the air filter cover. Should just be a wing nut, but if it's been replaced, or a wing bolt actually, some vans you'll find it's been replaced with a hex nut. And now we can take out the center console. So to remove that, you've got 12mm bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then quite often it's a Phillips for the last one, or actually it's a JIS, but chances are you don't have JIS screwdrivers. So Phillips number 2 will have to do. Once you get these bolts out, make sure you keep them separate from the seat bolts. The center console bolts have a large washer. The seat bolts actually have a small washer. You should have 4 with the small washer and 6 with the large washers. Now we can take out the Phillips. On my van, it's actually a Phillips number 3. We're gonna take out the piece of the center console here. There should be 2 screws, but the rear one is stripped in this van. Get that out of the way. You've got 1 plug here for your park brake wire, and then you'll need a 10mm, well actually you'll need 2 10mm wrenches to remove your park brake cable. And finally, we also need to take off the gas door release. So 2 screws, the handle pops off, and then we can simply slide the cable out of the handle. And with that, our center console should be free to remove. Okay, with the engine cover and the seat out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the radiator shroud. Now obviously, you're going to have 2 sides to remove. My van decided to remove the shroud by itself. And with the shrouds out of the way, we have access to all the belts. Now the 4056 in the L300 actually has 4 belts on the front. You have your power steering belt, which loops from the water pump pulley to the power steering. You have 2 water pump belts, and then you have your AC belt. If you're working on a Pajero, you might have 1 thick belt instead of the 2 water pump belts. It depends on your vehicle. Now you notice my van isn't running an AC belt, and that's because my AC simply doesn't work and I couldn't be bothered to fix it. I honestly never use it anyways. For those of you that are running AC, you're going to need to take that belt off to access the other belts anyways, so you may as well replace it. To remove it is very simple. Your tensioner is located right here. In behind, you'll find there's either a 12 or a 14mm nut. I don't remember offhand. You'll need to get in there with a wrench, loosen that off, and then you can loosen off the nut on the top here, and that will allow your tensioner to slide down and you can get the belt out of the way. As for the rest of the belts, we're going to start off with the power steering belt. The power steering belt is tensioned by the power steering pump itself. In order to get that off, you're going to need to use a 12mm wrench to loosen off the jam nut, and then again to loosen off the pivot. Now you'll notice that I did use the open end wrench to loosen off that jam nut. And that's because the wrenches that I own have an anti-slip on the inside of the open end. And what that means is there's basically a profile here which prevents the wrench from grabbing onto the corner of the nut or bolt, and instead it grabs to the flat surface and prevents it from rounding off or stripping off the bolt. If your wrench doesn't have that, be careful using the open end. If you strip that thing out, it's a real nightmare to get off. So if you feel like your wrench is starting to slip at all, stop and use a socket instead. I'll show you how to do that. Take a look closely at the pulley. You'll notice there's 2 holes, one on either side. All we need to do do is line one of those holes up with the bolts, and now we can get our socket through to loosen it off. Obviously, to turn that pulley when it's tightened is going to be a lot more difficult. You'll have to crank the entire engine over to get it to line up. It is doable. It can just be a little bit of a nuisance. Now that our power steering pump is loose, we can push it all the way in and get our belt off. Now this part here is a little bit odd, but we're simply going to work the fan around each of the fan blades one at a time until we're able to remove the entire belt over the fan. There we go. With the power steering belt out of the way, we're going to move on to the two water pump belts. You can access all of this from the top. It's just a little bit more awkward, so we're going to roll underneath to get the first pivot bolt. So here we are under the van, and if you still have the skid plate on, you're gonna need to remove that first. Once you have the skid plate down, we need to locate the alternator pivot bolt. So we're gonna look between the engine crossmember and the front axle straight up, and you'll see our belts right here. Follow the belts back to the alternator, and then the alternator pivot bolt is right here. We're going to loosen that off and then head back up top. The other thing that it's a good idea to check while you're down here is the alignment of your alternator itself. The pivot hole on these can ovalize, and once it ovalizes, it allows the alternator to actually sit at a little bit of an angle, and that'll cause a belt squeal that you're almost never able to get rid of. So have a look at your pulleys, make sure your alternator pulley is sitting true to the harmonic damper and not at an angle. If it's at an angle, then you've got bigger problems that you're going to have to deal with before you can replace the belts. Now that we have our pivot bolt loose, we need to actually loosen off the adjuster itself. Now, you can do it just with your regular wrench. It's just a little bit awkward. If you have a ratchet wrench with a swivel head, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Now, I'm going to do my best to film this area, but it's very, very tight in here, so you'll have to forgive me if this is some pretty crummy footage. So to get to our adjuster, we need to access it behind the lower rad hose. Now, you can see the lock bolt here and the adjuster, but the second bolt is right up under here, which is a little bit more awkward to get to. First thing we're going to do, though, is loosen off the lock bolt. We don't need to take the jam bolt all the way out, just loosen it off enough that the adjuster can slide. This is where I say a flex head wrench really comes in handy. Next, we'll loosen off the adjuster bolt, and again, we don't need to remove this, we just need to loosen it off enough that we have access. I find using a pry bar here to move the rad hose out of the way can make life a lot easier. Once the adjuster is loose enough, you can pull the bolt up out of the slot. Now with everything loose, you can either put a pry bar down in beside the frame and the alternator and pry it up gently, or if everything moves smoothly enough, you can just grab the belts and pull them up. That should leave you with enough slack to remove the belts. Okay, so we've got the belts out of the way. It's also a real good time to just give your water pump a quick spin. Make sure you don't hear any bearing noise. Do the same with your alternator. Make sure everything sounds good. And also check your clutch fan as well. So hold the pulley in place, turn the fan. You should feel nice even resistance the whole way around. As long as those check out, we can go ahead and put our new belts on. The belts we're going to put back in are OEM Mitsubishi. Here's your part number for the power steering and for the water pump. Now I can already hear a bunch of people out there going, but you could save a whole bunch of money and buy a crossover locally. You're right. You absolutely could. Just in my experience, they start squealing again way too quickly. I don't know why, they just do. The ones that came out of here, they're not that old. One of them is an AC Delco, the other one's a Napa, and they started squealing again. I've gone through so many belts, and I just find, for whatever reason, the OEM ones last longer. So that's what we're going with. The reinstallation of the belts is the exact opposite of how we removed them. So we're going to start with the water pump belts, and then we'll move on to the power steering. We'll start by getting both belts seated on the harmonic dampener, and then we'll move on to the alternator pulley. Look and feel around the entire belt to make sure everything is properly seated. And then you can move your alternator back out a little bit. Once you know all of your belts are lined up, you can go ahead and start tensioning them. So get your lower rad hose out of the way, push the adjuster back into the slot, and then we can start tightening that up. Once you feel you've tightened up the adjuster enough, check the deflection of the belt by pushing down between the water pump and the alternator, and we're looking for about 10 millimeters of deflection on a new belt. So if you've got 10 millimeters, you can call that good. Tighten up the lock bolt, and then climb back underneath to tighten the pivot. Then we can go ahead and install our power steering belts. The new belt's going to be a little bit tight to get around the fan blades, but it will fit. You just have to coax it a little bit. tighten it up, you're going to need a pry bar, and you're going to insert it between the mounting bracket and the pump, and then put a little bit of pressure on it. And again, we're checking for deflection between the two pulleys, and with a new belt, we're looking for between 6 and 8 mil of deflection. So right about there, then tighten down the lock bolt. Recheck your tension. If you're happy with it, go ahead and tighten down the pivot bolt as well. So that's all there is for my vehicle. Because I'm not running the AC belt, obviously, I'm not going to put one on. For you, if you are running AC, you are going to need to install that belt still. So simply slip the belt over the pulleys, then using the adjuster on the tensioner, tension up the belt until you have about 8 millimeters of deflection, and then tighten down the adjuster. Then that's all there is to it. From here, we simply have to reassemble the engine bay, put the seat back in, and take it for a test drive. So our old belts are now out, new belts are in, and it looks like that has taken care of the squeak. Engine's running nice and smooth, everything is quiet, so I'm gonna call this job done. If you like today's video, please hit that like and subscribe. Really motivates me to keep on going. Otherwise, get out of the shop and do something. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.